Today I'm going to show you how to use your histogram in Photoshop. Hey guys, and welcome to Phlearn. My name is Aaron Nace, and you can find me on Phlearn.com, where we make learning Photoshop and photography fun. And today's episode is all about understanding the histogram. Now, this is a super helpful episode, especially if you've ever had a little bit of issue getting your exposure right. If your images come out too bright, like maybe your highlights came out a little bit blown out, or your shadows were a little bit too dark, this is something you can improve by understanding the histogram. Now, the histogram is basically just a graph. It shows you the lights and the darks in your image. And if you're too far over to one side or the other, you can use this information to correct the exposure in your image. So we're going to show you how a histogram works in Photoshop. And after learning how a histogram actually works, you can use this to help you in camera as well. All right, guys, we got a fun episode. Let's go ahead and jump into Photoshop. So here's our first image we're going to take a look at. And by default, the histogram tool isn't up here. So I'm going to go to Window and down to histogram. Okay, now I went ahead and popped mine out, but if yours is like stuck in one of these menus or something like that, you can always just grab your histogram and pull it right back out. That might be an easier way to look at things. Okay, now we've got a couple different views with our histogram. This is just the standard view. So we're gonna click here on our menu and go to where it says expanded view. There we go. So here in the expanded view, basically we have a lot more information to look at. Not only can we see the histogram information in RGB, which is basically all of the information for our image, but we can take a look at the lights and the darks for each one of our color channels. Now, personally, I like this other option. I'm going to click here. Let's go to our menu and go to where it says Show Channels in Color. That basically just says if you're in your green channel, it's going to look green. If you're in your blue channel, it's going to look blue. It's just a little bit better visually. So we can also see the information for each one of our color channels. All right, so if you're curious about what all these mean, we're going to go through and explain them. Let's start with RGB. So RGB is basically a combination between the red, the green, and the blue color channels. So as I look at my image, this is basically everything in my image. So here on the left-hand side, we have our darks, and on the right-hand side, we have our lights. And this kind of makes sense, right? Like the image has a lot of light into it, so we can see we have a lot of information here on the right. And it really doesn't have any darks. Like, as I'm looking here, I don't have anything that goes all the way to black. So that's represented here in my histogram. We don't have anything that goes all the way to black. All right, let's take a look at our different color channels. So we have RGB here. Let's take a look at red. Now, red is basically, although you don't see this image and look like, oh, there's a lot of red in there, there is red in here. Basically everything is made up of a little bit of red, a little bit of green, and a little bit of blue. So you can look at your different color channels as well to see kind of like where the distribution of this information is. Now, personally, I don't really use the red, green, and blue channels separately so much, especially when I'm just like analyzing the image. Most of the time, RGB is that's what's going to be most helpful because you're going to use this to work on exposure. But we do have a couple more options. So we have RGB, we have our red, our green, and our blue, so we can see the different amounts of light for each of those. Then we have our luminosity, which is going to be very similar to RGB. There we go. So this is just, instead of combining the different color channels as well, this is just lights and darks. So if you turned your image black and white, this is what the information would look like there. And then here with our colors, we can see all of our colors kind of mashed into one another. All right. So basically, we got a graph that represents the colors, the lights, and the darks in an image. Now let's take a look at a couple different images to see how the histograms compare to those. All right, so we're gonna load up a different image. We're gonna go to Window and down to our second image. And we can see our histogram completely switched here because we have a lot different information in this photo. Now you can see we actually have a lot of information here where the darks are. And that makes sense. We have here on the left-hand side, we have this area that actually has some darks in it. Here in the middle, we have a lot of like this kind of like middle gray. And then this is kind of like a light gray we have here in the sky, and that's represented here as well. Now, this kind of has the opposite issue that the other one has. This one, we don't have anything going towards white. You can see it kind of drops off here, and that's like, now we have a little bit of a void here. Now, an ideal histogram contains information from just about everywhere, from the left to the right. So the left-hand side of this looks perfect, where we're just kind of peaking with our black levels, getting a lot of detail there, but I wish I had a little bit more information here in the light. So in a minute, we're going to show you how to use levels to correct that. All right, let's take a look at another image. So we're gonna go to Window and then down to our other image. Okay, and we've got an awesome picture of a baby here, and you can see our histogram is totally different here. Now, in this case, we don't have a lot of information here on our darks, and check out our lights. They're so loaded up over here. We even have a little caution sign that tells us our whites are overexposed. So we can see there's a huge peak right here in our whites, basically telling us that we don't have any information in our whites. We've gone over to the right too far to where we've actually lost information. And as I zoom into the image, you can see that's true. I mean, look at this area, this white area here in the blanket, and here like on the top of the hat and things like that. This is what's called blown out. These are highlights that like I don't have any information here, and we can see it visually here as well. So anytime you have information that's like peaking, where your histogram like this goes all the way to the very top on either the right or the left-hand side, it means that a huge percentage of your image is over your exposure. So in this case, we're overexposed to the right-hand side, which means we don't have any information in our lights. So when you're looking at an image in Photoshop, this might be pretty obvious to tell, okay, we don't have any information there, but also you can look on the back of your camera. So when you take an image on your camera, you can use your info button on the back, depending on what your camera mode is, but you can oftentimes take a look at your histogram while you're actually shooting. So if you take a look at your histogram and your histogram looks like this in your camera, you know you have to bring either your light source down or you have to bring your exposure down a little bit so you still have some information here in your lights. You never want to see this in your camera because it means you've overexposed your image. You don't have any information in those light areas. Now, if you have a huge peak here in the dark side, where like if this were basically reversed, it meant you didn't have any information in those darks, which you don't want that either, meaning you have to bring up your exposure. So really what we want here is all of our information to fall, kind of in a graph here without any huge peaks on all the way to the right or the left. Okay, so that's an idea of how the histogram actually works. It's basically just a graph. It shows us what's the lights and the darks, and you can look at different colors as well. So now let's take a look at what you can actually do in Photoshop to kind of help fix your image a little bit using the information from your histogram. All right, so we're back to looking at our first image in Photoshop, and we can see here's our huge gap here. We don't have really any information here in our darks. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna grab an adjustment layer. We're gonna go down to levels. Now here in our levels, you're basically gonna see our histogram. Let's go ahead and spread that out a little bit. We're gonna see our histogram basically mirrored what's going on here in our histogram is here in our levels as well. But now I have a little bit of control over what I do to my image. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. If I bring my levels over here to the right, we can see that our histogram is starting to spread out a little bit. And that's because I'm basically taking the midpoint of our image and pushing it to the right. Now, as I go to right about there, we can see now I'm starting to have actual blacks and lights in my image. So right about there, we can see, looking at our histogram, that now we have what should be like a properly exposed histogram. So we have darks all the way here on the left-hand side, and we have lights here on the right-hand side. So let's just kind of get everything else away so we can see our image. This is the image with actual darks in it, and here's our before with basically just some grays in it. So we can use a level adjustment layer to actually make sure that we do stretch out our histogram. Now, there's one thing we want to look at here, and that's all these holes. You guys can see, instead of having like a really nice full histogram here, we have all these like lines that are separated, and those are holes. Now, the reason why we have that is because as I move our midpoint out, what happened is it takes the existing amount of information and it stretches it out. But we don't have enough information here to properly stretch out our histogram. So what happens is our image quality winds up degrading. Now, here's a big hint for you guys. If you do wind up not exposing your image correctly and you need to push your levels either to the right or to the left, shoot in 16-bit. If this was a 16-bit image, I would have a lot more information here to actually work with. Because it's an 8-bit JPEG, I don't have a ton of information, and that's why it's kind of spreading that out. So while my image looks like our histogram looks a little bit better, we have some holes here, and that's what's actually causing my image quality to not look that great. We have just a couple of errors. Like if I were to continue going with this, we would start seeing, let me just continue going so you guys can start to see what the issues are. instead of having smooth transitions between highlights and shadows, we get all this stuff where it starts to look like a little bit more. Here, we'll just kind of enhance this a little bit more so you guys can start to see what I'm talking about here. There we go. Instead of having this be like a nice, smooth, even gradient, we just get a hugely degraded image where this just like, we lose a lot of information. So all these holes here in my histogram, that basically says we've lost information. So while this, let's go ahead back to the original, this looks like a really nice exposure here, we don't have information there in our darks. So we can use levels to kind of bring that back, but keep in mind, it's going to basically take the existing information and try to stretch it out to fill in those gaps. All right, so that's kind of like a balance you have to choose. Do you want to actually like stretch your information out and maybe lose some information, or do you want to not have information in your blacks? So that's why it's important to try to get your exposure just right in camera so you don't have to try to stretch it out and fix it in Photoshop. Now we have another way of adjusting our levels in Photoshop, and that's actually to take our dark point. So here's our white point. Basically, if I bring this from the right to the left, it's gonna say anything to the right of this is gonna be defined as totally white. So we can see here all of our images going totally white. We don't have a lot of information in our image, and then here we have a huge peak on white, and that makes sense because that's what's actually going on. Now I can take this left-hand slider as well, and I can start bringing this to say everything to the left of this should be completely black. And basically what I want to do is bring this point right here to about there, where we do have, basically now I'm readjusting my histogram, so we do have information here in our darks and in our lights. There we go. So if I just take a look at this, let's go ahead and hit tab to get everything away. We can see our image is much more properly exposed there. So we have stretched our histogram a little bit, but instead of moving our midpoint, which stretched everything, we took our black point and brought that up. There we go, which properly defined our histogram just a little bit better. All right, cool. So now let's take a look at our other images and see how we can help those also. All right, let's go to Window and down to our second image. Now here we actually have the exact opposite problem. Let's go to our Levels Adjustment layer. There we go. And here instead, we do have actually really nice detail here in our blacks, but we have a gap where our lights are. And that's because we've just got basically just a gray sky here. So if I want to bring this area closer to white to get like a full histogram, we can take our white point and start bringing this from the right to the left. And now, I mean, you don't want to go farther. You don't want to bring this point into the area where you actually have information, because then you're going to start clipping, right? You can see if I go too far, obviously that looks horrible. So we want to make sure we bring this point right to the area in which we start to have some information. Now, there we go. We can see our histogram is stretched out a little bit more, so we have lost some information. There we go. But our image technically represents a lot more of the available histogram. It goes from dark all the way to light, instead of before it was going dark to like mid-gray. So that way we can fix it as well. Now let's go ahead and close this out. Here in our histogram window, we have a few different options as well. We can have this view the entire image, which we're gonna have. We can do a selected layer, which I could like select my background layer and then have just the selected layer we would see there. That's really nice too. And this is really cool. We can actually use our selection tool. So I'm gonna grab my marquee selection tool and we're gonna select just this area. And now what I'm able to do is view the histogram for just that area. Or if I wanna view the histogram for just this area. So let's say I wanted to adjust the dark levels for this area. Well, I'm gonna grab a levels adjustment layer. Okay, it's going to be, again, just that area. So let's go ahead and make sure that selection stays a selection. There we go. And now I can bring my black levels into the proper area for that, there we go, for that selection. And we'll bring our whites, there we go, to include some information as well. So what I basically did is I took a selection of just that area, which allowed me to see what my actual histogram looked like. So that's my histogram, right? So if I want to like have this area then stretch out to be both the darks and the lights, we can do that by bringing in our darks, there we go, and bringing in our lights. All right, now I wouldn't recommend doing this like everywhere on your entire image because eventually we're gonna start to lose some information. By the way, if you are editing in 16-bit, you can push and pull your exposure much more than if you're not. So that's in that area There we go. Let's go ahead and close these out. That's in that little area there, and we use it as a layer mask, and you can see it's like, wow, that made a huge difference right there. Well, if I want to use my brush tool, I'm just going to use my layer mask and my brush tool to make that more visible in the rest of the image. I want to try to not include the layer here, this area in my foreground, because that's a completely different exposure. So we're going to try to paint this in here. There we go, on just this information there. All right, so we could use, there we go, our histogram to properly expose, or actually, bring out the highlights, midtones, and shadows for every single part of my image. There we go, and let's just make it like super slightly visible right up there, and then kind of fade that out a little bit there. Cool. So we can see, and you could do a better job masking, obviously here in the foreground. There we go, let's turn that off. Obviously you would want to like use a pen tool or something to make an accurate selection there. But basically we just use our levels adjustment layer to bring up the contrast here of that area, making it represent the full area of our exposure, which made a huge difference in those mountains there. Now, that's not to say that before was wrong, right? If we had the fog in our image before and now it doesn't look that foggy, that's not saying fog was wrong, it's just didn't represent the entire area of our histogram. So we basically changed it until it did. All right, guys, let's go ahead and take a look at our third image. So here we can see we've got whites that are completely blown out here in my image. So I'm gonna go to Window, we'll go back down to our histogram. There we go. And now let's go ahead and bring up a levels adjustment layer. There we go. Now we can see we have information that's so far over to the right-hand side that we've lost information in the whites. And that's basically a limitation of what's going on in your camera. Basically your camera's like, okay, this is so bright, I can't capture any information here, so I'm just gonna make it all completely white. Now, there are some things you can do to get back this information, but for the most part, once that information is gone, like it's just not there, then it's just not there. So what we're gonna try to do is I'm gonna bring my midpoint to the right here, and we're gonna try to bring back some of the information in my highlights. Now, here we can see we did bring back some of the information that we have. There we go. Let's go ahead and close this down so we can see our image a little bit better. We are able to bring back some of this information, like here in the background, we were able to get some of that information back. But here in the hat, this area is just completely blown out. There's so much white here that we were not able to get this information back. All right, so here my levels adjustment layer, we can see, although I'm trying to stretch out my histogram, it's not gonna give me the information that I need here, and it's gonna make some of these areas a little bit too dark. So when you have an image like that that is completely blown out in the whites, basically that's something that needs to be corrected in camera. So again, if you're looking at take a picture, and if you're looking at the back of your LCD and you see the histogram and it's loaded off to the right, you just need to make sure your exposure comes down a little bit, because even in Photoshop, there's really not a lot you can do to correct this. All right, guys, and that's how the histogram works in Photoshop. I hope this episode helped out, and the next time you take a picture, take a look at the back of your LCD screen. Now you'll understand that histogram a little bit better, and it'll help you get a proper exposure. In this episode, we showed you how to analyze your histogram, looking through different color channels like the red channel, green channel, and blue channel. Now your darks are on the left side of your histogram, and the lights are on the right side of your histogram. Now, a proper exposure is going to exist inside of the histogram. You want to avoid peaking on the left and the right-hand side. That's going to mean you're either underexposed or overexposed. Next, we showed you how to use a levels adjustment layer to actually change the information that's in your image. Now, a word of caution here. If you are going to be stretching out your levels, you're basically taking the information that's in your image already and stretching it out. So you're going to experience some image degradation. So you really want to make sure you get your exposure right in camera. Then we used our selection tool to analyze a specific area of a photo and used the levels adjustment layer to just affect that area. We went ahead and layer masked that in and got rid of the fog that was in our image. All right, guys, so we can see how useful the histogram is in Photoshop. And be sure to look at your histogram in camera as well. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and watching this episode on histograms. If you love Photoshop and photography like I do, you probably want to click on your screen right about now, because we're gonna put a giant subscribe button on there, and that is the best way you can watch free Photoshop and photography episodes from us every single week. And if you have an idea for an episode or a question or a comment, leave it right down below. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll Phlearn you later. Bye, everyone. All right, guys, give yourself a round of applause, because we did it.